previous presidents have always been very careful to set limits, establish these things that the diplomats like to call guardrails these days.
Right.
They did that from Eisenhower on. All of a sudden now they're gone, and we're doing the bidding of Mr. Netanyahu and his agents and backers in the United States and around the world. It's not a good picture for the United States. It's bad for President Trump. The other thing is that if he had been serious about this and his staff was doing their jobs, if the NSA was advising him, and for that matter, the Secretary of State, they would have all weighed in and said, Mr. President, let us talk to the people in the region. What do the people in Cairo think? What do the people in Riyadh think? What do the people in Ankara think? I mean, all of these people have a stake in what happens in Palestine. And to sort of say, well, everybody I've talked to thinks it's a great idea, and he finds out overnight, immediately, everyone else says, absolutely not. It's horrific. He's now not just complicit, he seems to be trying to extend this wholesale ethnic cleansing operation, mass deportation or mass murder operation in Gaza as far as possible. And then he tells everyone, well, once we've done this and we've rebuilt this place and it looks like Las Vegas on the Med, anybody can come and live there. Well, that's like saying we're gonna roll over everything on the coast of Florida, and Tampa and St. Petersburg are going to rebuild everything, and then anybody who wants to live there can come and live there. Well, this is America. In the case of the Palestinian Arabs, Gaza is their home. That's their country. How can you dispose of all of this without any consideration whatsoever for any feelings or interests? So I think this has harmed us. I think it's harmed him. I think it's made us look ridiculous. It makes us look as though we are the willing puppet of this small state called Israel in the Middle East. That's unfortunate. Well, I'm sure, his Jewish friends in New York City and Las Vegas and elsewhere are enthusiastic. No doubt Mr. Netanyahu, grinning like a Cheshire cat, is delighted with the prospect of having the United States permanently embroil itself in the tar pit of the Middle East on behalf of Israel. We need to point out to the listeners and the viewers that this has been walked back. If you go towards the end of the day yesterday when all of this developed, this new woman who is the spokesman in the White House, Mrs. Leavitt, I think is her name.
Yes.
She made it very clear that this was not something that was going to go forward. She was, very politic about it and very diplomatic, but this is dead in the water. But what the Israelis have done now is so horrific that I doubt he's going to get any form of cooperation in the future whatsoever out of Egypt. But in the meantime, for us to step in and say, we'll now pick up Gaza as the 51st state and we'll protect it, put American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on duty there to protect it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is ludicrous. I think the good news is he's figured it out. The bad news is that these impulsive statements are dangerous. And the same thing is going on with the Russians. He's got major issues in the United States to deal with. He's talked about those. He was voted into office on that basis. He knows the border is a disaster. He's talked about it. That's where he should focus. He needs to disengage from these places overseas. What happens in these places is just not important to us. Well, remember when Begin and Sadat negotiated the end of the 73 war, Begin tried to turn Gaza over to Egypt. And Sadat said, absolutely not. They're not part of Egypt. They are not Egyptians. And he wanted desperately to offload his quote unquote Gaza problem onto Egypt. Now, the Egyptians have cooperated to limit the violence and the capabilities of Hamas and others because they have a mutual interest, or at least had, in suppressing Islamism. Genghis Khan, perhaps the greatest of generals, said occupations turn soldiers into jailers. Mongols never occupied anything. They would put a new group into power once they'd conquered an area, and they would tell them, you collect the tribute, you pay the taxes, we'll provide the security. And there would be a small contingent there to back up the local government. But they did not occupy anything anywhere. They did not set out to change societies, to change culture, to change religion. And Hamas is by no means destroyed any more than Hezbollah is. But he may think that he's bought more time for Israel to renew the fight and go back and finish the job, which is why he wants all of those 2,000-pound bombs and all the other munitions he can get his hands on. There are lots of Israelis who believe that he has systematically destroyed the Palestinian position and any hope of a Palestinian state. That was the goal, one of the goals. The underlying purpose, though, was to drive everybody out of Gaza. Well, that hasn't quite worked. I think he's going to stick with the first one. It's in his interest to do so, gives his forces a break to rest, refit for the next phase. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to rely primarily, once again, on the hundreds of aircraft that he's got, the Air Force to do serious damage to any number of different enemies, but he's not going to follow through on the rest of it. And I don't think anybody on the other side of these matters, whether they're in Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Hezbollah, anywhere else, Syria, no one believes that. A friend of mine in the Navy who is an expert in missiles and travels all over, where he's just recently returned from the Pacific, told me, he said, if a war lasts longer than 2 weeks, we run out of all conventional munitions. At that point, we have to go nuclear. Well, that's absurd. We don't ever want to go nuclear.
Right.
We are in a very serious condition right now, and our armed forces do not need to be rebuilt. We need to build new armed forces. The world has changed. Warfare has changed. This business of rebuilding the old plant all over again is the wrong way to go. The intelligent thing for the president to do right now is to say, we've got to disengage and retrench. We're going to run out of money. We're on the verge of a fiscal crisis, something we've never seen, certainly not since the Depression. I don't know how we come out of it. But the bottom line is we don't have the resources, we don't have the forces to do this in perpetuity. And that's effectively what we're signed up to do. And then someone in the back of the room will say, well, what about country X or country Y? What about the border? How many thousands of troops is it going to take us to really secure the border? And when we do, and we cut off the drug cartels from their enormous profits from human trafficking as well as drug trafficking, we're going to have a war on our hands. I think we have a war there now. Why are we not focusing on those things? And he knows that. I know President Trump, and I know he's concerned with those things. So this has all got to go away. He's got to stand up and say, look, I love Israel. I love the people. I want to help them in any way I can. But I cannot join their war in perpetuity. I cannot make their enemies America's enemies. This is not a relationship that we should want to have. All small states always have an interest in dragging a large power into their region to do their bidding. That's what we are right now. We're the suckers who've been drawn in to do the bidding of the Israeli. We've been in this business now for almost 30 years off and on. It's failed miserably everywhere. This would be, a road to certain ruin for us. And very shortly, Americans would look around and they would say, what are we doing here? This is what I try to tell people so often. Soldiers, Marines, they're not stupid people. They arrive at a place like this in Gaza. They look around and they say, what the hell are we doing here? We're not going to be able to change anything here. These people don't want us. They're going to shoot at us eventually, regardless of what happens. And they all understood that. But the generals and the politicians insisted, oh, no, we're bringing them this and that liberal democracy or whatever other benefits there are. The people in Gaza are not interested in living in luxury condos overlooking the ocean. I'm sure if you built them for them, they would probably consider it seriously. Right now, they just want to go home. And look at the photographs, the masses of human beings marching north back into areas where they used to live, where there is, as Secretary Rubio pointed out, nothing for them. Well, it looks like he recognizes who the real boss in charge is, and that's obviously Netanyahu. This is a shameful display of subservience that is completely inconsistent with the interests of the United States and the American people. It's hard to fathom how we got here. But let's be frank. The president would not now be in the White House were it not for the enormous quantities of money that were poured into his campaign by donors who are enthusiastic Zionists,
Right.
wealthy Jews. We understand that. But he's still the president of the United States. Hegseth is probably on the ragged edge of getting himself into very serious trouble. He needs to look at the limitations of our assets and our resources. It's this callous disregard for the lives of human beings. However much you want to support Israel, we as Americans are not interested in the destruction of human life in Gaza. That's not something that we all agreed to do. It's something that should be judged as reprehensible. The idea that we will take this over and rebuild everything sounds wonderful until you get to the question of what happens to the population that lives there. And the underlying truth is that President Trump and Netanyahu are both agreed that these people will be forcibly removed. To where? Under what circumstances? Hopefully now that you've gotten this dramatic response out of the whole Islamic world, and not just there, but also President Xi in China, now President Putin in Moscow, everyone has said this is unacceptable. We wouldn't support this anywhere in the world. And as I keep telling people over and over and over again, I like Israel. I supported the state and support helping Israel defend itself. But I didn't sign on for this project that is now involving expulsion and murder of hundreds of thousands, million people. It's incomprehensible. It's un-American. But there's no sense of that right now. And I think he must be operating in an echo chamber. Somebody has got to step inside and tell him, look, this is not what we are about. This is not what we as Americans support. Why are we doing this?
Right.
I think Donald Trump is someone who doesn't want a war. I've said that from the beginning. His instincts tell him wars are not good for presidents. But people can be talked into things, and he is someone who can be talked into things. It's not his forte. He's much more comfortable talking about business and economics and so forth. He's also got all of these donors standing behind him who have poured tens of millions of dollars into his campaign to get him elected. And they too want war with Iran. So I think it's a very difficult position that he's in. I wouldn't second guess him at this stage, but I would not exclude the possibility that he falls for the argument. We can do this. We'll do it quickly. It'll be over in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I mean, that's something that General Wes Clark told Bill Clinton when he was president about the Kosovo Air campaign. And President Clinton said, how long do you think this will last? And he said, well, 3 or 4 days, 2 weeks at the most. Very hazardous statement to make. Wars are not predictable things.
Right.
So I think you've got a similar situation here. It depends on how much trust and confidence the president has in either Netanyahu or Lindsey Graham or Mr. Waltz, his national security advisor, who is also an Iran war advocate. So I wouldn't be surprised. I doubt seriously that Mr. Hegseth would push back against this. He's also another Iran war advocate. The worst thing that could happen for Mr. Netanyahu is for President Trump to strike a quote unquote deal with Iran that leads Iran, in a position to build a nuclear weapon. He doesn't want that. He wants absolute certainty that there's no potential capability for that at all. That may be difficult for President Trump to deliver. And overheard this mentioned, whether or not it was something that President Trump said or someone else, who knows? I would be very careful not to rush to assume that. Now, if, as you say, he emerges from the meeting and announces that, then that would suggest that he's made it clear to Mr. Netanyahu that regardless of what Netanyahu wants, we are going to open a new chapter in our relationship with Iran. I would welcome that, as I'm sure you would, because I certainly don't want to see a war between Iran and Israel or anybody else over there. But I wouldn't bet on it yet. He is, in my judgment, for President Trump's purposes, the voice from hell. And if President Trump continues to invite him into his inner circle, he's making a very serious mistake. But I think that Lindsey Graham and Mr. Netanyahu are unambiguously on the same page. I think they both want that war desperately, and they want us to be in it. And they think that they can be successful early on with the right kinds of strikes. We've heard that sort of thing so many times in the past, going back decades. It doesn't make any difference. once you open the door to a war like that, it has a bad habit of running in all sorts of directions you never anticipated, which is why I and many others would prefer no war at all, Judge. I think what President Netanyahu wants is a guarantee of continued delivery of all the ordnance and military equipment that he needs, whether it comes in the form of F-35 jets or missiles, rockets, anything. And I think he will certainly get that. As you know, President Trump has just announced $1 billion worth of equipment on its way to Israel. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I think there will be a discussion about what's happening in the region. And that's going to be difficult because President Trump is not comfortable with what's happening in Gaza. Remember, he said, I want you to get it over with. Now, you and I regard that as a rather callous remark, given that we're talking about the lives and property of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. Well, that hasn't happened. And what he's gotten is instead a truce. And I think there'll be some discussion about pressing ahead to, quote unquote, finish the job in Gaza, whatever that means. And then there's the second part of this. What are we going to do to help the Israelis secure their northern border now with Syria? They've moved into Syria. They want to retain territory in southern Syria. Are we going to stand by that and allow them to acquire that and keep it? And that puts us at odds potentially with the Turks. Then the other issue is the Kurdish problem in Syria. There are large numbers of Kurds, thousands that are ready to fight against the Turks if the Turks decide to remove them. There's a lot of evidence that that's actually beginning now. Are we going to pull all our forces out or not? You'll recall that in the past, President Trump has said, I want those forces out, and then ultimately he backed down. What the Russians want to do is put together a regional design that would provide for the security not only of Russia, which they are obviously interested in, but also Europe and us. And I think it's a grave error to misinterpret and misunderstand what the Russians want. This is a once in a, I don't want to say a century opportunity, but certainly an opportunity that should not be missed for President Trump to sit down and with his advisors and design a new way forward for security in Europe that does not involve any future conflict, that will reduce the tensions, change the way we do business. It's so vital at this stage because the Russians are not interested in attacking anybody in the West. And they don't like the idea, obviously, of British troops or any NATO troops inside Ukraine policing the DMZ. You know, even though they admit that, yes, we think Ukraine has to be neutral, what's the point of neutrality if you're going to set the situation up like that? So the Austrian model, which is really the model I think that the Russians would accept, is not really on the table. And I don't think the president understands he has no leverage over the Russians. None. This looks like the same plan that he and Mr. Flights put together. I don't think it's going to go anywhere because it involves the things which Lavrov and Putin have said are unacceptable to them. And I don't see any evidence that the Russians are going to change their position. They are not going to accept some sort of line based on a frozen conflict. They're not interested in a Korean-style solution that leaves a demilitarized zone between East and West Ukraine. I think General Kellogg, like most people in Washington, are permanently frozen in the Cold War. They see everything through a lens that is distorted. They don't understand how the world has changed. They don't understand our limitations and our capabilities any longer. They're living in a world that passed over the last 30 plus years. They think this is 1991. It's not. Well, I think it's useful to point out that as far as we can tell, he receives, this is the president of Ukraine in the form of Zelensky, $11 million a month. That's his salary. So we can certainly point to waste, fraud, and abuse there. That's what the Russian and actually the Ukrainian press, it's out there, $11 million a month. And then on top of that, you know, we could point to his real estate holdings. They're worth tens of millions. And we don't even know with certainty which banks hold enormous quantities of cash. So I would say that he is probably the chief thief in Ukraine. Now, he would probably argue that he's not, that he's had to pay off oligarchs who backed him That may be true. But the real point is we've sent a lot of money over there. We know that a lot of it was essentially put into this laundering machine in Washington, D.C. that allows us to ship equipment and pay for it right here in Washington. But the equipment goes to Ukraine, but cash, not so much. But we've still sent enough cash in terms of hundreds of millions from time to time that he's being able to pay off his government. Everybody in the parliament is richly rewarded for their support. And of course, the officers in command of Ukrainian troops are earning vast sums of money. It is one giant scam. It makes Bernie Madoff look like a patriot in the United States compared to this man. The Russians right now have an enormous amount of military power concentrated in a couple of key places. One is across from Kiev, and the other is further south down near Kherson. They can move whenever they decide to move, and there's nothing the Ukrainians can do about it. We know that. If we continue to prevaricate and lie, as we have thus far, about the true state of affairs on the ground, they will eventually move. And there won't be anybody to sign anything because it won't be necessary. The entire Ukrainian state will have collapsed, and the Ukrainian population that remains is not going to put up a fight at this stage because they've had enough. So you'll end up with the Russians in charge, period. And we will have thrown away any opportunity we might have ever had to help shape some sort of outcome that would have been remotely beneficial to Europe or the Ukrainians. I was hoping that President Trump would realize that the policy in Ukraine is dead. I would argue that the policy in the Middle East is also dead, but immediately end what's happening in Ukraine, get out of it. But instead of that, he seems to have decided to extend it, perhaps because he thinks he can extract some goodness from it. After all, he's arguing that in return for rare earths, we would provide more military aid. Well, I don't know who the military aid will go to. I mean, there are 1.2 to 1.5 million dead Ukrainians. They can't replenish the ranks. There are no substitutes. The state of Ukraine is effectively destroyed. So where is he going to get the people to operate the equipment he gets? I think it's ridiculous, but apparently that's President Trump's idea that if he can extract rare earths from them, that would be a benefit. The problem is the rare earths are all in the areas that are populated with Russians, and the Russians currently control them. So you're not going to get any rare earths out of that. There's $7.8 trillion supposedly worth of rare earths. They are all under Russian control in eastern Ukraine, which is Russian. That's everything from graphene to beryllium to lithium, any number of different things. In fact, there's a major lithium mine also in that area of eastern Ukraine. There were always coal mines there. And coal mines, in the seams of the coal mines, you get rare earths, by the way. We've got that here in the United States. Been a big source of frustration for me that we're not maximizing our focus on that. But having said that, the only thing worth having in Western Ukraine, where there are no rare earth deposits, as far as I know, or anything else, that is the black earth, the rich agricultural land. Well, here's an interesting flash. Cargill, DuPont, and Monsanto already have bought up the rights to most of the land in Western Ukraine. So I don't know how he handles that, but this is part of Mr. Zelensky's effort to sustain himself and his regime in power by selling off assets. But the rare earths in particular, forget it, President Trump, you're never going to see them. There is an assumption in the Trump administration that Ukraine is a viable state. It is not. There is an assumption that the Ukrainian military, with additional aid, can recover and continue to fight. That is untrue. There is an assumption in the Trump administration that they can overcome the corruption that riddles the country by extracting some benefit from rare earths. That's not going to happen. The 7.8 trillion of those are in the eastern part of Ukraine under the Russians. And there's this other underlying assumption: Russia's bad. Russia's the enemy. President Trump knows better than that. These people are not the enemy of us. They're not the enemy of Western Europe or Eastern Europe. There's no interest in going to war with us, and he should step forward and make that clear. But for some reason, he's decided to stay on point. That's why I said the clinging to this carcass of dead policy is a serious mistake. If he doesn't get out of this and distance himself from the folly and stupidity of his predecessors, it could well drag him into the pit. What President Putin will want are confidential discussions. He's not interested in, grabbing the stage for a big splash in the media that something great has happened and I, Donald Trump, have done it. If President Trump wants this to succeed, President Trump should go back to saying what I heard him say the other day. We're talking and we're making progress. Thank you. Next question. Stop talking about the details. Don't get into it. Hegseth did a good job thus far. Let's leave it there. And if we're going to send the envoy over, let that all happen behind closed doors and let nothing be leaked or shared until there is substantive agreement. You'll recall back in the 80s, people used to talk about, let's have a Gorbachev summit. It became a metaphor for the major heads of state showing up and agreeing to something after there had been long, exhausting negotiations to get an agreement. Well, I think that's where we need to go now. So I hope that whatever the president says, he's going to go back to what he said before. We're talking, we're making progress. Thanks very much. That's the right answer. And what Hegseth has said is encouraging, but it's not an end state. The only end state really of great importance to us is that NATO has nothing to do with Ukraine and no American forces will be involved. That's good news. The rest of it, I think, is negotiable, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. And President Trump made it very clear to me and anybody else who cared to listen to him years ago that he thought the Europeans should be their own first responders. In other words, this reliance on U.S. forces to go thousands of miles from the continental United States into Europe to marshal air and naval power on a moment's notice to defend Europe was ridiculous. It didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense from the threat standpoint because Russia doesn't present that kind of threat, nor is Russia interested in it. And he's tried repeatedly to persuade the Europeans they must be responsible for their own defense. I think what probably President Trump would like, and I'm sure Secretary Hegseth would probably be receptive to this, is that fine, if this NATO thing survives, that's great, but you've got to take the lead. And remember, all the times you and I have spoken, the op-eds I wrote saying over and over and over again, a European four-star should replace the American four-star. We've got to get out of the business of taking responsibility for the command and defense of the European theater. That's not our problem. And I think at the end of the day, I think that's really what Secretary Hegseth is saying. Let's get out of this. We'll backstop you. We will stand by you, in the event of a serious conflagration. We'll back you up. But you've got to take the lead and defend yourselves. I think that's very clear. I think that's what President Trump wants, and he should want it, and the Congress should want it. But we all know Congress will fight it because you're disrupting a money flow that's become very, very useful for a lot of people, only not the American people. I think we're living in a different age now. I don't see any interest in Germany, among any Germans, in invading France, or the French are not interested in fighting with the Italians or the Spaniards. I mean, this stuff's over with. Eastern Europe, there's some unfinished business, let's be frank. And that's going to come to the fore. Hungary lost a great deal in World War I and even more after the Second World War. That's unfinished business. There's unfinished business for them in Ukraine. There's unfinished business with Poland in Ukraine. But these things are not our affair. And these things will have to be sorted out regionally. I think the world collectively, ever since the 1970s, has been moving towards greater regionalization, Dan. In other words, instead of seeing the global community as a community, we need to see the global population organized into major powers in each of the region that operate as arbitrators and maintain peace, security, and build prosperity. This is something that was predicted by a man named Hedley Bull at Oxford, long before anybody wrote The Fourth Turning or Toffler's Waves or anything else. I think we're there. Well, I have a newsflash. There have been disputes and conflicts all over the world for thousands of years, long before we existed. There will be more conflicts and disputes after we're dead. In other words, once we leave, will there be a potential for disputes and conflicts, yes. But the Europeans, certainly before the First World War, demonstrated pretty conclusively after the Napoleonic Wars that they could handle those things. I think Europe will devolve to some extent into new regions because the problem in NATO was always the same. The view of things from Berlin did not match the view from Madrid, and the view from Paris had nothing to do with the view from Stockholm or Athens. And that's more true now than ever. So I think you're going to see new security arrangements emerge, which is fine. They should, because they have a greater chance of succeeding than anything we impose. And right now, NATO is a legacy of our imposition, let's be frank. Eisenhower pointed out when he was president, a group of Army generals came in to not lobby, but make presentations to the president about their need for more transportation to move more forces to Europe. And they said they had to have 29 divisions in Europe to stop the Soviets. And he said, how many divisions have you got that you could conceivably send? Well, we only have 15 divisions. He said, well, then find out what the shipping requirements are and the aviation requirements are to move 15 divisions. You're not getting anything more than that. Well, that took the wind out of their sails. But then he privately pointed out, look, we're never going to get across the Atlantic and the Pacific again the way we did during World War II. It can't be done, or World War I. The submarines, the long-range precision strike, the growing overhead constellation of ISR, he said this is going to be impossible. So if we put something over there, it stands an excellent chance of ending up at Dunkirk, a giant Dunkirk. And even then, we may never get the troops out.